Good morning, everybody, and thank you very much for the chance to speak at this event. I'm on the same topic as Alison. I'm going to echo quite a lot of her messages, but with a slightly different perspective, coming from a more international view inwards rather than the Australian outwards. But certainly what I'm going to echo is a lot of her enthusiasm and optimism about the opportunity. I think sometimes coming into the Australian industry, I see a lot of concern and negativity and people willing to put down the opportunities here and say, well, we haven't met the metrics and others are doing more. I think there's fantastic opportunities here. You do see that by the amount of foreign companies who want to come in. I can tell you that when you go overseas, all the countries are looking at Australia and saying, isn't Australia doing well? How are they doing that? How can we emulate that? And so I think sometimes we're a little bit too keen to find what we're doing badly, and we need to celebrate what we're doing well and do more of it. So let's look at some of the numbers on a pure, we're talking about global. How global is the wheat industry? Well, and how's the demand going? And so these numbers, you've got the red lines just showing global demand. It's been going up at a very steady 1.5% per year since 2000, all the way from 587 up to 706. Nice and smooth line. The export line is a lot more bumpy as you get disruptions in supply and changes in demand, but has gone from 103 up to 154, so it's grown at 3% per annum. And so relatively speaking, you've had more of the demand come from exports and global trade flows rather than internal demand, although still the majority is domestic and only 22% goes as a global flow. If you look at where those flows come from, wheat is really quite interesting because going back to 2000, you already had a fair amount of diversity in where global trade flows in wheat were coming from. The US was the majority player at 28%, but you also had quite a few other players that were fairly large. So the US and then FSU was small, and then Canada, Australia, and the EU. By the time you get to 2013, that pie chart is really very evenly spread. And so US has come down, Black Sea has gone up dramatically, and you still have Canada, Australia, and the EU sitting there. And so what you have in the wheat market, more than any other agricultural commodity, is a lot of origins competing for the demand. If you look at soybeans, for example, US and Brazil take 80% of the demand. Even in corn, where the US has also been slightly marginalized, if you take the US, Brazil, and the Black Sea, that's 85% of demand. Wheat truly is a global market in the literal sense of the word, that a lot of origins are participating in the export flow and competing for demand. Now, that's even more true when you think about the fact that we're in this environment of low freight. And that was mentioned last night. And it does matter, because when you have low freight, it means it doesn't matter if you put the wheat on boats that have longer voyages, because it can still be competitive. And so where in an environment of high freight, we might have in Australia a freight advantage of $15 or $20 to some destinations. In low freight environments, that might only be $5. And if we have higher costs on the transport and the elevation of that wheat, that disappears extremely fast. The other thing that's happening at the moment is that even though commodity prices have come off a bit, we're still in a high-priced environment and have come off a very high-priced environment. In environments like that, a lot of the wheat millers will look for ways to reduce their price, and they'll do that by blending wheat. And so rather than just staying to one high-quality wheat like the Australian, they may blend it with other origins. And so you do have this truly global competition in the world of wheat. So those are the numbers. Let's look at some of the themes, and some of these have been touched on, but there's a couple of points I want to add in here. And so the point was raised this morning by Adam that we've got these increasingly linked markets because of biofuel, and that's absolutely true. And so what you see now is that wheat has always competed for land each year. For here, it might be with canola. In the US, you might have soy competing with corn for land. But once you've got biofuel as this big factor in agricultural commodities, you've got wheat, corn, sugar, palm oil, vegetable oil, all linked because of their link to biofuel and energy and petroleum. And that's something that we just haven't seen before. A lot of these markets would trade on their own supply and demand economics before, and now they are all linked. The other thing that's linking them, and it's partly a consequence of the biofuel, is that financial investors are now interested in looking at commodities as an asset class. And so they're interested in investing in gold and wheat and beef as a way of diversifying against stocks and bonds. And so as you get those moves in and out, you truly are creating this globalized market of commodities and putting things together that simply never worked before. And part of that is through the invention of things like the ETFs, exchange-traded funds. And so there are now mechanisms for trading commodities and bringing them all together that simply didn't exist. Second one, and there's a picture of Shanghai up there. I actually sort of wish I'd changed it because we've talked so much about Asia. And clearly Asia is super important, and particularly China. So I'm not going to go more on Asia, but I think it is worth calling out also Africa and the Middle East. And so the Middle East is an area with growing population, growing demand, very little ability to grow its own food supplies. And so while it's normal that we are focusing very much on Asia because of the geographic link, I think one of the things that we have to understand, and as we're looking at the complexity that's growing in this world, that we also need to look at what's going on in the Middle East and Africa, which are two of the regions that are also growing a lot. The other thing I think that's interesting, and it's slightly off topic, but it does matter in the context of food and globalization. We talk a lot about growing populations and therefore growing demand. We talk about rising incomes and therefore changing diets and growing demand. But there's one other factor about population and demographics that we talk about a lot but don't link with food very much, and that's the fact that we've got aging populations. And so we know as we go forward that a lot of that population growth is also because we've got people who are living longer. Now, someone who's 20 years old does not eat the same amount or the same things as someone who's 80 years old. And so another piece of the complex puzzle that we're having to live with today is how is that going to change the demand for food? As we get this aging population, what might that do to the demand for different commodities? And I think that's going to increasingly be something that we do talk about. Touched on food security a little bit. Food security is now an issue for everyone. It's an issue in Australia, in a country where we really do produce pretty much everything that we need. And so if it's talked about here, imagine how it is talked about in countries like China or the Middle East, in places where they really aren't able to do that. And so when we talk about food security, that essentially is about being able to provide safe, nutritious, and affordable food for everyone. Every government is worried about this, and this is where you start to get, on a global basis, a lot of things coming in around regulations, non-trade barriers, protection. And so again, one piece of this very global, complex puzzle that we all need to live in. But it's not just governments. It's also around the consumers. Because for the consumers, increasingly, safe, nutritious, and affordable isn't enough. They want to know, was it produced on sustainable land? What were the labor practices? If it's around animals, what were the animal husbandry practices? And so consumers are increasingly wanting a lot more from our food supply chains. And so if you add all this up, it means a lot more complexity, a lot more volatility, and not just that the change is constant, but the pace of change has increased, I think, more than ever before. So very fast-moving, very difficult environment. That is something that is not particular to the agricultural world. It's a nature of the world that we live in today. And as Alison said, we can't change that. What we can change is how we respond to it. And so whether we choose to see that as an opportunity or we choose to see it as a disadvantage and a problem. And I do think there are enormous opportunities that come with it. There are challenges, but I think we can overcome it, particularly in this environment. So here's what Alison was referring to a little bit, that we've gone from, in Australia, somewhere where we had very split by state, the agricultural industry was really run by these state boards, And we've moved to something more consolidated and more international. This is something that is relatively true elsewhere. If you look internationally, she also mentioned, but the amount of people who are actually marketing Australian wheat overseas has also increased. This is also true relatively elsewhere. So if you think about the wheat market as a whole, it's actually quite fragmented. As we said, it's very fragmented in the number of origins competing for that demand, but it's also actually quite fragmented in the ownership of the assets and in who's marketing it. And so in each of the regions, you tend to get local regional players who have a strong local focus and customer relationships in that. And that's whether it's in the Black Sea or Brazil or Argentina. And then you get these multinational players who have got bigger. And so the trend has been for the multinationals to get bigger, but also for a large percentage of that flow still to be held by locals who have local expertise. And what's really disappeared is some of the people at the middle level who haven't made it to the big league and have been bought out. But those local players everywhere are still extremely important. What's interesting, though, is that we've been asking the question, so why haven't we had a global Australian ag player come out? Well, I can tell you in Brazil they would ask the same thing, in Russia the same thing, in Ukraine the same thing, Kazakhstan maybe the same thing. And so particularly in the places where you've had this explosion of growth in production and exports, but still there haven't actually been any international players that have come out of that. They've been very much locally focused. And so it is the big players that were already there, had the patient capital, in many cases that were privately held, that have gone on to grow, and the other ones have stayed more regional. So is all this good or bad? Well, I think it's good. And I think when we bring it back to what does this mean for the farmer, I think what we need to redefine is the relationship between agribusiness and the grower. And so the way that Cargill looks at that, and this is something that we do on an international basis, is in 3 simple words: helping farmers prosper. We see that as our goal and our aspiration, whether it's in Ukraine, the US, Australia, Canada. Our role is to treat growers as customers and partners and work with them to be successful, because if they aren't prosperous and they aren't succeeding, then we won't. And so we look at it, again, something that historically was just about a farmer selling to agribusiness as a price equation, and we want to make it much more than that. And so whether it's around growing my crop and working, we contract grow on high oleic canola, some of the specialty products that Alison was talking about. In parts of the world, we get involved in fertilizer distribution, so we do that in Canada, for example. Doesn't mean we'd do it here. It would depend on what the growers would want. This is a model that the idea of helping farmers prosper isn't something that's copy-paste from one geography to another. It will depend on the local situation and what growers want. But the concept is that we want to do more than just buy from farmers. We want to work with them. And so whether it's growing the crop, storing and transporting, and I think agribusiness has a real role here in making sure that we can have more effective supply chains, take costs out, be more productive, marketing my crop, and so this is way more than just putting something into a pool. I personally think that pools have a very important role within price risk management as part of a portfolio. I don't want to throw that history out, but I think we need to modernize them and make sure that they work. But we want to offer more than that, and I think that's what the future will hold. And then looking at the farm business as a whole within managing my farm enterprise. And so if we think about this highly complex, highly volatile world that's likely to keep changing at this fast pace, I think we need to just be able to respond. And I certainly see that as the role of Cargill, and very much hope to work with growers in this country to make sure that we achieve that. Thank you very much.